Crossfire Legion. So it's a new RTS, and I'm a pretty big RTS fanatic. I've played Starcraft, Starcraft 2, Age of Empires 4, and the Total War games. So let's see how this game compares to those pretty major titles. So what is Crossfire Legion? Well, it's a brand new RTS created by Blackbird Interactive and published by Prime Matter. They sponsored this video so I could give my first impressions on the game, and I'd like to explain what's unique about it. Now, what is this game even about? Well, on the mechanics side of things, it's very much like StarCraft 2, at least in the style of game that it is. You have two resources in the top right, which are basically the equivalents of minerals and Vespene gas. The first resource is good for mass-producing units and structures, while the other is primarily used for more rare units and technology upgrades. But on that front, Crossfire Legion does act a little bit differently than StarCraft. Instead of constructing a different building to access higher tier units, you upgrade your production facilities themselves. Other than that, though, you get a lot of the conventional RTS mechanics. There's stealth, detectors, flying units, and various activated or passive abilities for your units. For example, a pretty nifty infantry unit who can cloak for 30 seconds and reveals themselves after firing. As for base building, you have three types of buildings which are similar across each faction. There's one for infantry, vehicles, and flying units. Now, between your three structures, you have 7 different units you can produce, with different units for each faction. Now, 21 units isn't a lot, but the game actually has 51, with you being able to substitute each unit with a different one, essentially choosing your roster before you start the battle. And this includes your abilities in the bottom left too. Swapping out your commander means a different pair of abilities. If this mechanic of roster building is very interesting to you, this might be a good reason to try out the game, as the publishers are pushing this as its unique feature. As for the campaign, there are 15 missions. I played on the hardest difficulty, and as an RTS veteran, I found it comfortably and enjoyably difficult. I even lost on this mission a few times, but that wasn't exactly my fault. Oh, those poor guys. Oh, my poor guys, what was that?
Phoenix, where the hell are you? Contact medium-sized enemy force, northeast grid sector.
My gosh. You killed all my guys in the cutscene, are you kidding me?
Damn it. Make that 8 minutes to get the data.
Whoa, that transition. That was a rough cut.
Here we go. Take down that anti-air turret.
But remember, the game is in early access. If you want a fully polished experience, it'll be better to wait for the full release. As for campaign diversity, did they mix it up well? I would say yes. Of course, you have your basic unit control tutorial missions at the beginning, and it did a pretty good job easing me into the mechanics without bogging me down in tutorials. Mission objectives for the maps that I played were diverse and ranged from escort missions, hero control, macroing up an army, and using stealth to get behind enemy lines. But the fun part was that the campaign wasn't too heavy-handed on which approach to take. For example, on this mission, I could simply attack with my allies, use heavy artillery to shut down flying units, allowing my allies to push easier, or sneaking behind enemy lines, deploying a teleporter, and sniping the objective from there. And during the mission, I used all 3 strategies to great effect while using a wide variety of units. Of course, this isn't vastly changing the scope of RTS campaign missions, but I definitely had a lot of fun with the campaign missions I played. Now on to multiplayer. Is it fun? I would say it definitely has a lot of potential, but I can't judge with the limited time I've played. You can't really tell multiplayer has longevity unless you've played it for a very long time. But I know it's definitely not boring when you're starting out. The gameplay starts pretty simple with just your base and some workers, but income is quite high and things will ramp up very quickly. Much like StarCraft, it seems like you're incentivized to expand early. New bases are cheap, costing only 4 units of infantry, and you're looking at doubling your income once they're secured. After that, there's a lot to manage with base building, scouting, unit micro, and managing your economy, which leads to a pretty high skill ceiling. All these tasks alone, though, are pretty easy to manage, so I feel like this is not too bad for a newer player to pick up too. And on top of all the general management, I think there's a lot of space for you to micro your army too. Pathfinding and general unit movement is not perfect in Crossfire Legion, which will be a problem for some people, but it does mean you will be rewarded much more if you micro your army well. Quite similar to StarCraft 1, where the units were so janky, you had to babysit them a lot just for them to perform normally. But on the other hand, if you're acting normally and your opponent's units are still glitching out, your units will be twice as effective. Oh my gosh. But in Crossfire Legion, it's not as dramatic of a difference between high unit control and low unit control. Pulling your units back and making sure that they're well spread out a little bit more effectively may only increase your effectiveness by about 50 to 20% depending on the situation. Definitely quite impactful, but using your abilities efficiently should have more or less the same effect. Of course, this is higher level multiplayer theory, but the game's still very approachable if you're new to RTS. All the factions play more or less the same, and they mostly differ in units. But the most important ones are on your roster, and in that case, you only have to learn 7. Not to mention, there's always the classic playstyle of turtling up on one base. Even though it's not the most optimal strategy, it's a pretty good strategy while you're learning the ropes. This is what my opponent did, and I managed to punish them by taking a bunch of bases and out macroing him. Now before we move on, a note on unit control. I did find a possibly unintended feature where a unit could shoot way faster than it's supposed to. This unit is the cheetah, and when you make it fire at a target, it shoots for about 1 second, after which it's basically reloading for a second. But the cool thing about it, you can basically move cancel out of your shooting animation, which means you don't have to reload and thus resetting your 1 second of shooting. Now this may turn some people off the game, and of course people are entitled not to enjoy this, but as an advocate of this type of mechanic, I don't think it's terrible. Many games like Starcraft 1 and Age of Empires have mechanics like this where an otherwise normal unit can perform much better. If any of you have watched Starcraft 1, you know about patrolling vultures. Essentially, another vehicle unit that can abuse its movement mechanics to do more damage. Giving it the patrol command instead of an attack command allowed the unit to turn on a dime and fire instantly at the same time. This made the unit way stronger than intended, but it sort of worked out. The skill ceiling in the game went way up, and it's just more enjoyable to watch because of it. So that's the core gameplay in a nutshell, but I didn't really explore everything. There are also quite a few modes for more casual play. For example, push the payload maps, which are PvP, and cooperative missions up to 3 people. Not to mention, these game modes are also good for up to 6 players, so if you want to host custom lobbies and play casually, the option is definitely there. However, I haven't been able to dig into this yet, so I don't really have too many comments there. You'll have to do your own research if this is something you're interested in. Now, last but not least, there's also the non-gameplay feature of unlocking your units. At the start, you only have access to your faction's basic units and commander. If you want to unlock different units, you have to spend this special currency, but thankfully, this isn't a pay-to-win mechanic, just a progression system which you can advance by completing various missions. They'll reset frequently, and they're very easy to complete. For example, there's quite a few you can unlock just by killing units in-game. So that's a lot of what the game has to offer, and if you're still watching, you're probably at least mildly interested in it, and there should be more content dropping every month. It's in early access, and if you want to see ahead, there's also a roadmap. If this has interested you at all the relevant links are in the description.